For 4 decades, Michael lived with a question buried so deep, it only surfaced in the quiet moments. A sense that something, someone, was missing. A feeling he could never explain. But it all changed with one click. A $99 DNA kit that would unravel everything he thought he knew about his family. What he discovered would tear open 40 years of secrets, betrayal, and an unimaginable truth. This is not just a story about DNA. This is about identity, loss, and a reunion that was never supposed to happen. Michael Carter had always felt like an outsider in his own family. He was raised in a quiet suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio, by parents who seemed fine, normal, supportive enough. His father, George, was a retired police officer with a rigid sense of discipline. His mother, Linda, was soft-spoken and kind, though distant in ways he couldn't fully explain. From the outside, their family looked picture-perfect. But Michael, now in his late 40s, couldn't shake the feeling that his roots were tangled in something he couldn't see. As a kid, he looked nothing like his father or his older brother, Jason. Jason had the Carter family's broad shoulders and square jaw. Michael, on the other hand, was leaner with softer features and a different shade of hazel in his eyes. It wasn't something anyone ever talked about, but Michael noticed. Every time they'd visit extended family, he'd hear whispers. He looks like someone else, or he must have taken after a distant relative. It was always followed by laughter, but it never felt like a joke. By the time he turned 12, Michael had started asking questions. Where did I get my nose? Why don't I look like you guys? His mother would smile and change the subject. His father, predictably, would tell him to stop being ridiculous. "You're a Carter through and through," George would bark, but that never felt like an answer. It felt like a wall being built between him and the truth. Years passed, and the feeling never left. Even after graduating college, getting married, and raising kids of his own, there was an emptiness that lingered like a shadow, a quiet echo that something, someone, was missing. He would lie awake at night and wonder why he didn't feel that deep, unshakable bond others described with their parents. He loved them, of course, but it was like loving a photograph, real but distant. When Michael's daughter, Emily, turned 16, she got him a DNA test as a birthday gift. It was part of a school project on genealogy, and she thought it'd be fun. Michael laughed when he opened it, but something in his chest tightened. For some reason he couldn't explain, he felt scared. He put the kit aside for weeks. Every time he saw it on the kitchen counter, he'd feel a strange pulse of anxiety. Why did it bother him so much? Why was something as innocent as a DNA test making his heart race? Eventually, he gave in. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, he sat at the kitchen table, opened the kit, and followed the instructions. Spit in the tube, seal it, mail it back. As he walked back inside from the mailbox, something shifted inside him. It felt like pressing play on a story that had been paused for too long. He didn't talk about it with his wife, Sarah. She knew about the kit but didn't push. She had always sensed Michael's unrest when it came to his past, but she respected his silence. Still, when he finally dropped it in the mail, she looked at him and said gently, "Maybe now you'll find what you've been looking for." Michael didn't know how to respond. What was he looking for? He couldn't name it, only feel it. The waiting was agonizing. Days stretched into weeks. He checked his email every morning with a tight chest. Every time he saw no results yet, it was like being told, not today, not yet. But deep down, he knew something was coming, something big. And once it arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the email finally arrived. Michael had just finished walking the dog and was sipping his coffee when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. "Your DNA results are ready." 3 simple words, but they made his heart drop into his stomach. He stared at the notification for a long time. The house was still. His wife had already left for work and the kids were at school. Just him, a quiet living room, and the answer to a lifetime of questions sitting behind a click. His hands trembled as he opened the app. At first, everything looked normal. A breakdown of ancestry, 60% Irish, 20% Scandinavian, traces of Eastern European. That made sense. His mom had always said they had Irish roots. But as he scrolled down to the DNA matches section, he stopped breathing. Right at the top, in bold letters, parent match, 99.9% shared DNA, female, estimated relationship, mother. But the name, it wasn't Linda Carter. It was Susan Miller. Michael blinked, thinking it must be some kind of mistake. His mother's name was Linda Carter, the woman who raised him, the woman who packed his school lunches and cried at his graduation. But the app showed a genetic match to a woman he had never heard of before, a complete stranger. His heart pounded as he scrolled further. Below Susan's profile were other close matches. Half-brother, 51.2% shared DNA. Name, Daniel Miller. Cousin, 25%, Emily Thompson. A cold wave washed over him. Michael felt the floor beneath his feet dissolve. He stood in his living room, gripping his phone, as the world he'd always known crumbled silently around him. How could this be possible? Was this a glitch? Was it some kind of scam? He reread the match over and over again. 99.9%. That wasn't a coincidence. That wasn't distant. That was biological certainty. He went back to the top and stared at the name again. Susan Miller. Who was she? And why did his DNA think she was his real mother? Michael tried to think logically, but his thoughts were scattered. He went to his laptop and started digging. He searched the name. There were hundreds of Susan Millers. Then, a detail on the DNA platform caught his eye. Lives in Dayton, Ohio. Just an hour's drive from Cincinnati. His chest tightened. He clicked on her profile, and to his surprise there was a photo. She was older, probably in her mid-60s, with soft features and warm eyes. There was something about her face, a curve in her smile, the shape of her nose. He gasped. He saw himself in her. That's when the denial broke. This wasn't a mistake. This was real. And then another thought hit him like a freight train. Linda knew. She had to. She raised him. She must have known he wasn't biologically hers. But she never told him. Not once in 48 years. Michael felt dizzy. He sat on the couch, trying to steady his breathing. This wasn't just about identity. This was about betrayal. He'd spent his whole life trusting the people who raised him, and now nothing felt certain anymore. He picked up the phone to call Sarah. She answered immediately. "Hey, everything okay?" There was silence on the line. "Michael?" He finally found his voice. "It's not what I thought. None of it." He explained everything. Susan Miller, the match, the other names, the undeniable numbers. Sarah listened quietly, her tone growing more serious with every word. When he finished, she said something that stopped him cold. "Maybe it's time to ask your parents the truth." The thought terrified him. What if they denied it? What if they turned it back on him, told him he was imagining things? But the seed had already been planted. The answers weren't in the app. They were in the people who had kept this secret buried for nearly half a century. Michael knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. The truth had been hidden in his DNA all along, and now it was finally demanding to be seen. Michael didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the name Susan Miller repeating in his mind like a haunting lullaby. His wife slept beside him, her breathing steady, a quiet reminder of the normal life he had built, a life that now felt like it stood on a foundation of quicksand. He had always suspected something wasn't right, but suspicion was different from proof. Proof left no room for illusion, no space for denial. The DNA test didn't whisper doubts, it screamed facts. And those facts had torn open a question he was now desperate and terrified to answer. Why? The next morning, Michael drove to his parents' house. The ride felt longer than usual, every mile a countdown to a confrontation he never imagined having. As he pulled into the driveway, the same childhood home he'd walked into thousands of times now looked unfamiliar, like a stranger's house wearing a familiar mask. His palms were sweaty as he knocked, even though he had a key. His mother, Linda, opened the door with her usual gentle smile, but when she saw his face, her smile faltered. "Michael, what's wrong?" He stepped inside, his voice low but steady. "We need to talk." His father, George, was in the living room, watching the news. He muted the TV and looked up, confused. "What's going on?" Michael didn't sit. He couldn't. The words were too heavy to carry while seated. "I took a DNA test. Emily got it for my birthday. It came back strange." His mother stood frozen, her face draining of color. George stiffened. "What kind of strange?" "It says my biological mother is someone named Susan Miller, and I have a half-brother, Daniel." There was silence, thick, charged. Linda opened her mouth but said nothing. George looked at her, then back at Michael. "That's not possible." Michael's voice cracked. "Don't lie to me, please. I need to know the truth." It was Linda who broke first. Her hands trembled as she sat down slowly on the edge of the armchair. "We weren't going to tell you, ever. We thought it was better that way." Michael's breath caught. "Better? For who?" She looked up at him, her eyes watery. "You were adopted, Michael, when you were just a few days old, from a private agency. Your father didn't want to do it at first. We had Jason, and things were tight, but I couldn't have another baby. And then we got a call. A young woman in Dayton had just given birth. She was alone, scared. She wanted a closed adoption." Michael's knees buckled, and he sank into a chair. It was true. It was all true. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, the question more like a whisper than a challenge. George finally spoke, his voice quieter than Michael had ever heard it. "We thought we were protecting you. We didn't want you to feel like you didn't belong. You were ours. You are ours." Michael shook his head slowly. "But I don't belong. You never even gave me the chance to know who I really was. You let me grow up believing in a lie." Linda wiped a tear from her cheek. "We loved you. We still do." Michael stood, the ache in his chest unbearable. "I believe you, but love without truth, it leaves holes." That night, back home, he couldn't stop looking at the profile photo of Susan Miller. He imagined what her life must have been like, why she had given him up. Did she think about him on his birthday? Did she wonder if he had grown up happy, safe, loved? Did she regret it? He didn't know how to reach out. What do you say to the woman who gave you life and then disappeared from it? He drafted a message in the DNA platform's messaging system, rewriting it 10 times before finally settling on, "Hi Susan, my name is Michael Carter. I recently took a DNA test and discovered we're a match. I believe you may be my biological mother. I have so many questions, and I hope we can talk. Please reach out if you're open to that. I don't want to disrupt your life. I just want to understand mine." He hit send, and then he waited. Hours turned to days, and just when he began to believe she might never reply, a new message appeared in his inbox. "Michael, I've been waiting for this message for 40 years. Michael stared at the message for what felt like a lifetime. "Michael, I've been waiting for this message for 40 years. It was a single sentence, but it carried the weight of decades, of absence, of silence, of questions buried and hearts torn in two. His hands trembled as he clicked to open the full reply. Susan's message was short, tentative but sincere. She told him she had always hoped, in some distant part of her soul, that someday he would find her. She had never stopped thinking about him. And yes, she wanted to meet. The days leading up to that reunion passed in a surreal fog. Michael told Sarah, who immediately held his hand and said, "I'm proud of you." He didn't tell his parents he was going. Not yet. Not until he understood everything. He needed this first meeting to be his, untouched by guilt or history or explanations. Just him and the woman who had given him life face to face at last. Susan lived in a modest, well-kept home in Dayton, surrounded by hydrangeas and a wooden porch swing that creaked in the wind. As he parked across the street, Michael felt his breath catch in his throat. He had driven an hour, but it felt like he had traveled across lifetimes. He sat for a moment in the car, staring at the front door, his reflection barely recognizable in the rearview mirror. What would she look like in real life? Would she recognize him? Would he recognize something in her voice, her movements, her eyes? When he finally worked up the courage to walk up the path, the door opened before he could knock. And there she was. Susan Miller stood in the doorway, her hands clasped nervously, eyes brimming with tears. She was older than the profile picture, of course. Softer around the edges, streaks of silver in her auburn hair. But unmistakable. And in that moment Michael saw it. Her cheekbones, her eyes, the same kind of sadness that he had carried his whole life reflected back at him. She smiled, but it trembled, uncertain, and that was what made it real. "Michael," she said softly, like saying his name made it tangible. "You're here." He nodded, barely able to speak. "I didn't know what to expect," he said. "I wasn't sure I'd come." She opened the door wider. "I wasn't sure you would either, but I hoped." Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and books. Family photos lined the shelves, none of him, of course. Strangers with the same nose, the same smile. It was like walking into an alternate universe where he almost existed. He sat on the couch, and she sat across from him, wringing her hands. "I owe you the truth," she began, her voice fragile but steady. "I was 19 when I had you. I was scared, alone, and my parents, they didn't believe in single mothers. They said if I kept you, they'd cut me off. I didn't have a job. I didn't even have a place to live. I convinced myself that giving you up was the only way to protect you, to give you a real chance." Michael listened in silence, a swirl of emotion storming inside him. Part of him wanted to be angry, to yell, "How could you let me go?" But the other part, the deeper part, understood. She hadn't abandoned him out of cruelty. She had let him go because she thought she was giving him something better. "Did you ever try to find me?" he asked. "I did," she whispered, "but it was a closed adoption. They told me it would be better for you if I stayed away, that you'd have a clean slate. I signed papers I didn't understand just to make the pain stop, and then I waited. I waited and hoped you'd want to find me someday." They sat in silence for a long time, the air thick with everything that had been unsaid for 40 years. Eventually, Michael stood. "Can I hug you?" he asked. Susan nodded, and as he crossed the room, they both broke. He fell into her arms like a child who had finally come home after a lifetime of wandering. She held him tightly, sobbing into his shoulder, whispering, I'm so sorry, I love you, I've always loved you." And in her arms, Michael felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child, a sense of being wanted not because he was someone's son, but because he had always been hers. In the weeks that followed their reunion, Michael found himself waking up each morning feeling both lighter and more uncertain. The truth had finally surfaced, 40 years of buried identity, unearthed with a click and a meeting. And now came the part no one talks about. What to do after the moment. What to do when the dust settles and you're left with a brand new version of yourself, holding the pieces of two different lives and trying to build one future. Susan called him every other day, sometimes just to hear his voice. They talked about music, books, memories that weren't shared but somehow still felt connected. She told him how she used to imagine what kind of man he'd grow up to be, that she'd look at boys on the street and wonder if they were him, that birthdays were the hardest. She always lit a candle, whispered a prayer, and wondered if he was happy. Michael didn't always know how to respond. He was still navigating his own grief, not for what had been lost, but for what had never been. He found himself staring at photos from his childhood and wondering how different they might have looked. Not better, not worse. Just different. And yet, in the quiet moments, he began to realize something strange and beautiful. This new connection wasn't erasing the past. It was expanding it, giving it depth, meaning, filling in the shadows with light. One weekend, Susan invited him to a small family gathering. Nothing dramatic, just her sister, and Daniel, the half-brother Michael never knew he had. Michael hesitated. He was afraid of being a curiosity, of walking into a room full of strangers who knew everything about each other except the part that now connected them to him. But when he arrived, the tension he expected never came. Daniel greeted him with a firm handshake that turned into a hug. "You look like Mom," he said with a smile, especially around the eyes. There was no bitterness in his voice, just wonder, curiosity, a quiet joy. Over dinner they laughed more than Michael anticipated. Susan made lasagna. Her sister told embarrassing stories from their teenage years, and Michael shared a few of his own, stories that didn't include them but still made them all laugh. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like an outsider trying to fit in. He felt like a man finally stepping into a room he'd been locked out of his whole life. Back home, things with Linda and George were complicated. Michael had told them about the reunion, about Susan. His mother wept, his father barely spoke. It was hard. There were moments of silence that stretched painfully between them, but Michael wasn't angry anymore. He had found grace in the wreckage. He understood, now more than ever, that love could be messy, that sometimes people do the wrong things for reasons they believe are right, and sometimes they just don't know how to tell the truth. He sat with Linda one afternoon, just the two of them. No accusations, no anger, just a quiet conversation over tea. "I forgive you," he said, "but I need you to understand something. Not knowing who I was, it hurt. For a long time." Linda reached for his hand, her eyes glossy with tears. "I know," she whispered, "and I'm so sorry. If I could go back—" "You can't," Michael interrupted gently. "But we can move forward. I'm not trying to replace anyone. I just want to live without secrets." From that day on, things began to heal, slowly, imperfectly, but truthfully. Months later, Michael invited Susan and Daniel to his daughter Emily's high school graduation. He introduced Susan to friends as "my other mom," and though the phrase startled some, it felt natural coming from him. Emily beamed with pride. She had unknowingly opened the door to this entire journey with a simple birthday gift, a 99 kit. And now, standing beside her grandmother, her biological grandmother, she saw how one choice, one question, could rewrite an entire legacy. As the ceremony ended and the family gathered for photos, Michael stood in the middle, arms around both Linda and Susan, their smiles real and their histories complicated. And as the shutter clicked, he felt something deep settle in his chest. Not closure, but wholeness. Because healing doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means building something new from its ashes. And that's exactly what Michael was doing. One honest, hopeful moment at a time. If this story moved you the way it moved us, don't leave without letting us know. Stories like Michael's aren't just about DNA. They're about identity, courage, and the power of truth to heal what time tried to bury. If you've ever felt like something was missing, or if you've reunited with someone you thought you lost forever, we'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next true story that might just change how you see your own life. From our hearts to yours, thank you for watching.